The marsh water was black in the hour before dawn. Cold bit through the hem of her skirts as she waded deeper, her bare feet sinking into mud that held the memory of centuries. The lantern swung from her wrist, casting trembling light across the surface, and beneath it shadows moved with purpose. She did not flinch. Her hands, reddened and scarred, reached into the water with the certainty of ritual. The leeches found her skin before she found them. They fastened to her calves, her ankles, her forearms with the hunger that made them valuable. She counted silently as they fed. 1, 2, 7, 12. The physicians in Harley Street would pay $1 per dozen, more if they were fat with her blood. Around her, the marshland breathed its damp exhalation, mist rising like the souls of the drowned. Other women worked in the darkness nearby, their lanterns distant and trembling, their silence complete. This was the trade that kept children fed and rent paid in the rookeries of Lambeth and Suffolk. This was the commerce of the body, measured in parasites and pence. The sky began to pale. She lifted her arm from the water, the leeches hanging like dark jewels, and turned toward the long walk back to London. Chapter 1. The Gathering. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has drawn its curtain across the sky, and the world has grown quiet and small. Wherever you are listening tonight, whether in the stillness of your room or in the last hours before sleep finds you, know that you are safe here. The past cannot harm you now. It can only whisper its truths across the centuries, and tonight we listen. If you are finding comfort in these histories, if this voice has become a companion in the darkness, please consider subscribing to this channel. It helps more than you might know, allowing these forgotten stories to reach others who seek the same quiet refuge in history's shadowed corners. And if you enjoy what unfolds tonight, leave a small mark of your presence, a thumbs up, a comment telling us where you are listening from and what hour finds you here. Are you in London, where this story begins, in America, across the cold Atlantic, or somewhere else entirely, where the night is just beginning or has nearly passed? These small gestures help this channel grow, help these voices from the past find new ears in the present. Now let us drift backward to a London that smelled of coal smoke and river rot, to a time when medicine wore a different face, when healing required not pills or surgery, but creatures drawn from black water, and when the poorest women of the city sold not their labour, but their very blood. Let us go to the marshes before dawn, where the leech ladies waited. The water was cold enough to stop breath. It crept through wool and linen, through the layers that separated skin from November air, and it found the flesh beneath with the patience of something that had waited in darkness since the beginning of the world. The woman called Sarah Good stood knee-deep in the marsh at Battersea, her skirts floating on the surface like the petals of some night-blooming flower. Around her, the land lay flat and featureless, broken only by clumps of reed and the occasional hunched shape of a willow. The year was 1842. The city of London lay 2 miles to the east, its presence marked by a yellow glow that stained the underbelly of the clouds. But here, in the marshland, the only light came from the lantern that swung from Sarah's wrist, and from the lanterns of the other women scattered across the water like fallen stars. She had been gathering leeches since she was 9 years old. Her mother had brought her to the marsh that first time, had shown her how to stand very still, how to let the water settle, how to wait for the first touch of the creatures against skin. The leeches lived in the mud and in the pools where the water grew stagnant, where oxygen thinned and only they could thrive. They sensed movement through vibration, heat through some mechanism that physicians claimed to understand but could not explain. When a woman entered the water, the leeches came. They came slowly at first, then with gathering speed, drawn by the warmth of blood moving beneath skin, by the promise of a meal that might sustain them for months. Sarah felt the first one attached to her calf. It was a sensation she had long since stopped fearing, though she had never grown to welcome it. A pressure, then a slight burning as the creature's jaws broke through the outer layer of skin, then the rhythmic pull as it began to feed. She did not look down. Looking down served no purpose, and sometimes brought a dizziness that could lead to falling. And falling in the marsh in darkness meant drowning in 3 feet of water that would hold a body down with the same indifference it held everything else. Instead, she kept her eyes on the horizon, on the place where the sky was beginning to pale from black to grey. And she counted. 1 leech, 2, 3 fastening to her other leg, 4 on her forearm where she'd rolled up her sleeve despite the cold. Around her, the other women worked in silence. There was Mary Pickett, who had 7 children living and 3 dead. There was Anne Driscoll, whose husband had been pressed into the Navy and never returned. There was old Catherine Ward, who some said was 70 and others claimed was 50, but looked ancient regardless, her back bent from decades of wading through cold water, her hands gnarled like driftwood. There were others whose names Sarah knew only as sounds called across darkness, and still others who never spoke at all, who arrived before dawn and left when their jars were full, ghosts of the marshland who belonged neither to London nor to the country, but to this thin place between. The work required a particular kind of courage, not the courage of soldiers or sailors, not the bright courage of men who faced danger with weapons in hand and comrades at their side. This was a quieter courage, the courage of women who returned again and again to a thing that harmed them because the alternative was worse. The leeches took blood, and blood was life, but they took it slowly enough that a woman could survive the taking if she was careful, if she did not let too many attach, if she ate enough to replace what was lost. The physician said a healthy woman could lose a pint of blood without ill effect. The leech gatherers knew this was a lie, or at least a truth that applied only to women who were already healthy, already well fed, already rested. They knew what happened when a body was asked to give blood week after week, month after month, year after year. Sarah had fainted twice in her years of gathering. Once when she was 12 and had let too many leeches attach because the jar was nearly empty, and her mother had been sick and they needed the money desperately. She had woken in the mud with Mary Pickett slapping her face and calling her a fool. The second time was 3 years ago, after her 4th child was born dead, and her body had not yet recovered its strength. That time she had simply folded into the water without sound, and Anne Driscoll had pulled her out and carried her to shore like a child, and for a week afterwards Sarah had stayed in bed in their room in Lambeth, her skin the colour of old paper, her heart beating so slowly, her husband feared each beat would be the last. But she had returned to the marsh. She always returned. The work paid 6pence per dozen leeches, sometimes 9pence if they were particularly large and well fed. A good morning's gathering might yield 4 dozen, enough to buy bread and coal, enough to keep the landlord from evicting them, enough to keep her 3 living children from the workhouse. The work was not steady. The leeches followed their own rhythms, abundant in spring and autumn, scarce in the dead of winter and the heat of summer. The gatherers followed those rhythms, wading into freezing water when ice formed at the edges of the pools, standing in summer dawn when the water was warm and mosquitoes rose in clouds that bit every inch of exposed skin. The lantern light caught the surface of the water and turned it to moving silver. Sarah reached down carefully and felt along her leg, counting the leeches by touch. 8. That was enough for this immersion. She had learned through hard experience exactly how many she could allow before the loss of blood became dangerous. 8 leeches might take half a pint between them. 16 might take a pint. More than that, and the world began to grey at the edges, and the walk back to London became uncertain. She began the careful process of removal. The leeches did not release willingly once they had attached. Their jaws held firm, and pulling them free by force would tear the skin and leave wounds that festered. Instead, she used her thumbnail, sliding it between the leech's mouth and her flesh, prying gently until the creature loosened its grip and fell away. She caught each one as it dropped and placed it carefully in the jar that hung from her belt, a wide-mouthed glass vessel half full of marsh water. The leeches were dark and glossy, their bodies swollen with her blood. They moved sluggishly in the jar, satisfied and torpid. These were Hirudo medicinalis, the medicinal leech, distinguished from other marshworms by the stripes along their backs and the powerful jaws that could pierce skin. The Romans had used them, the Egyptians before that. For thousands of years, physicians had believed that disease was caused by an imbalance in the body's humours, by an excess of blood that needed to be drained away. Leeches were one method, lancets and bowls were another, but leeches were preferred for delicate work, for applying bloodletting to specific areas, for treating women and children whose veins were difficult to find. By the time Sarah had filled her jar, the sky had turned from grey to pale blue, and the first birds were calling from the reeds. Her legs ached from standing in cold water. Her hands were numb. Small wounds marked her skin where the leeches had fed, wounds that would seep blood for hours until they clotted, wounds that sometimes became infected if the water was particularly foul. She waded back to shore, her feet finding the path by memory, and she sat on the bank beside her shoes and stockings. The other women were emerging as well, some with full jars, others with only a few leeches rattling in the bottom. The gathering was done for this morning. The sun was rising, the city was waking. It was time to bring the harvest to market. They walked together, the leech gatherers, following the muddy track that led from the marsh toward the river, then across Battersea Bridge, where the toll-keeper knew them and waved them through without payment. Their skirts were wet to the knee, their feet muddy despite the stockings they had pulled on, their faces marked by sleeplessness and cold. Other early risers passed them on the bridge, costermongers pushing carts loaded with vegetables, labourers heading to the docks, gentlemen returning from night entertainment still wearing evening clothes now rumpled and stale. Some of these passers-by glanced at the leech gatherers with curiosity or disgust. Others did not look at all. The women were part of London's invisible economy, part of the vast network of people who did work that gentlefolk preferred not to think about. They walked north through Pimlico, through streets that grew gradually cleaner and wider, where the buildings changed from cramped wooden structures to tall Georgian houses with painted doors and iron railings. They walked until they reached the edge of Belgravia, and there they stopped at the shop of an apothecary named Thomas Critchley. The shop was narrow and dark, its windows filled with bottles of coloured liquid and dried herbs hanging in bunches. Inside, the air smelled of camphor and laudanum and something else, something organic and faintly rotten. Mr. Critchley stood behind his counter, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, and he examined each jar of leeches with the care of a jeweller examining stones. He held each jar up to the light, counting the leeches, checking their size and vitality. A healthy leech would move when disturbed, would attach quickly to skin, would feed efficiently. A dying leech was worthless. He paid Sarah 6pence per dozen, 3 shillings in total for her morning's work. She held the coins in her palm, feeling their weight, then tucked them into the pocket sewn inside her dress. 3 shillings would buy a loaf of bread, a measure of tea, a scuttle of coal. It would not buy meat. It would not buy new shoes for her eldest son whose soles were worn through. It would not buy medicine when the winter coughs came, but it would keep them alive for another few days, and that was all she asked. Mr. Critchley recorded the transaction in his ledger, his pen scratching across paper with the sound of small claws. He bought leeches from a dozen different women, hundreds of leeches each week, thousands each month. He kept them in tanks in the back room of his shop, feeding them on his own blood when necessary, maintaining them until the physicians sent their servants to collect them. The demand was constant. Every hospital in London used leeches. Every private physician kept them on hand. Bloodletting was prescribed for headaches, for fevers, for inflammations, for congestions of the chest and stomach. It was prescribed for women suffering from hysteria, for men suffering from gout, for children suffering from croup. The medical journals debated the proper quantity, the correct placement, the ideal frequency, but they did not debate whether bloodletting worked. That was accepted as fact, as certain as the rising sun. Sarah left the apothecary shop and walked back toward Lambeth, back toward the rookery where she lived in 2 rooms on the 3rd floor of a building that leaned noticeably to the left. Her husband would be awake by now, dressing for his work at the tannery. Her children would be hungry. The day stretched ahead with its familiar shape, its familiar hardships. Tomorrow she would return to the marsh before dawn, the day after that as well. This was her life, measured in leeches and shillings, in the slow draining of her blood into glass jars, in the walk between darkness and dawn. She did not think of it as strange. She did not think of it as a choice. It was simply what women like her did to survive in a city that offered them few other options. The marsh would be there tomorrow, black and cold and patient. The leeches would be waiting, and she would return to them because there was nowhere else to go. Chapter 2. The London Trade. The leeches travelled through London in jars and buckets and wooden boxes lined with damp moss. They travelled in the hands of errand boys and servants, in the bags of apothecaries making their rounds, in the pockets of physicians who kept 1 or 2 specimens on hand for emergencies. They travelled from the marshlands of Battersea and Wandsworth to the consulting rooms of Harley Street, from the muddy shores of the Thames to the pristine wards of Guy's Hospital and St Thomas's. They travelled through a city that was the largest in the world, a city of 2 million souls pressed together in a space that medieval London would not have recognised. A city that sprawled and stank and seethed with commerce of every kind. And among all the goods that moved through London streets, coal and cloth and tea and sugar and tobacco and grain, the leeches occupied their own peculiar position in the economy of survival. Thomas Critchley's shop in Belgravia was one node in a network that stretched across the city. He was not the largest dealer in leeches, nor the most prestigious, but he was reliable, and reliability mattered more than grandeur in a trade built on living creatures that could die without warning. He kept his stock in the back room, in slate tanks that he had commissioned from a stonemason in Lambeth. The tanks were shallow and wide, filled with water that he changed twice weekly, drawing it from the pump in the courtyard and carrying it bucket by bucket up the narrow stairs. The leeches lived in this artificial marsh, clinging to the sides of the tanks or lying torpid on the bottom, waiting to be sold. Each morning, after the leech gatherers had delivered their harvest, Critchley would transfer the new specimens from the jars into the holding tanks. He did this carefully, checking each leech for signs of disease or damage. A leech with torn skin would infect the others. A dead leech left in the tank would foul the water and kill everything within a day. He had learned these lessons through hard experience in his first year of trading, when he had lost an entire stock. 300 leeches dead in a single night because he had failed to notice one corpse floating among the living. The loss had nearly ruined him. Now he was meticulous. The leeches he sold went to 3 classes of customers. The first and largest were the hospitals. London had 5 major hospitals in 1842, ancient institutions that traced their founding to medieval charity, but now served a different purpose, teaching hospitals where young physicians learned their trade on the bodies of the poor who had nowhere else to go. Guy's Hospital used more leeches than any other institution in the city, sometimes 200 in a single day during the fever season. The hospital sent a porter to Critchley's shop every Monday and Thursday, a man named Perkins who carried a leather satchel with compartments designed to keep the leeches separate and alive during transport. Perkins paid by invoice, the hospital settling its accounts monthly, and Critchley extended this credit because losing Guys as a customer would have been catastrophic. The second class of customers were the private physicians, men who treated the wealthy in their homes in Mayfair and Kensington. These physicians sent their servants to purchase leeches as needed, usually in small quantities, a dozen at a time. They paid more per leech than the hospitals, sometimes twice as much, because they could pass the cost along to their patients, and because they demanded the finest specimens, large and aggressive feeders that would attach quickly and drain blood efficiently. Critchley kept his best leeches aside for these customers, feeding them on his own forearms once a month to keep them sharp and active. The third class were the poor themselves, people who could not afford a physician, but who believed in the power of bloodletting and who purchased leeches to treat themselves or their families. These customers came to the shop in the evening, after work, and they negotiated prices with a desperation that Critchley found uncomfortable. They might buy a single leech for twopence, applying it themselves to a feverish child or an inflamed joint, following instructions passed down through families or learned from neighbours. The leech would feed and fall away, and they would return it to Critchley the next day for a penny refund, a system he had devised because these customers could not afford to lose even that small sum. He would place the returned leeches in a separate tank, resting them for a month before selling them again to the hospitals where such refinements did not matter. The trade had its own vocabulary, its own customs. Leeches were measured by size: small, medium, large, and extra large. The last category reserved for specimens as long as a man's finger and as thick as a thumb. They were classified by origin: English leeches from the marshes near London, Welsh leeches from the pools of Glamorgan, continental leeches imported from France and Germany when the English supply ran short. The continental leeches were larger and more aggressive, but they cost more and died more easily in the transition from foreign water to English tanks. Most apothecaries preferred the native stock. Prices fluctuated with supply and demand. In winter, when the leeches were sluggish and difficult to gather, prices rose. In spring and autumn, when the marshes yielded abundant harvests, prices fell. A particularly harsh winter could drive prices to £1 per leech, making bloodletting a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. A warm autumn with heavy rains could flood the market and drop prices to 3p, squeezing the profit margins of apothecaries and gatherers alike. Critchley tracked these fluctuations in his ledger, noting not just the transactions but the weather, the season, the state of the marsh waters, building a body of knowledge that allowed him to anticipate shortages and stockpile leeches when they were cheap. The apothecaries themselves formed a loose guild, meeting occasionally at a coffee house in Holborn to discuss prices and suppliers, to warn each other about fraudulent gatherers who might sell inferior specimens or short-count their jars. They shared information about the best marshes, about which gatherers were reliable, about new techniques for keeping leeches alive through the summer heat. They complained about the physicians who demanded impossibly fresh specimens, about the hospitals that were slow to pay, about the competition from chemists who were beginning to sell patent medicines as alternatives to traditional bloodletting. These meetings had the character of ritual, men of modest means and ambiguous social standing asserting their importance in the medical economy, defending their territory against encroachment from above and below. The leeches themselves knew nothing of this economy. They lived in their tanks in darkness or dim light, their primitive brains registering only hunger and the absence of hunger, the presence of warmth and the absence of warmth. They could survive for months without feeding, their metabolism slowing to near dormancy, waiting with the patience of stones for the next opportunity to attach and drink. When that opportunity came, when a servant arrived with an order and Critchley scooped the required number into a jar, the leeches would be carried back out into London, through streets they could not see, to rooms where they would fulfill the purpose for which they had been gathered. Sometimes they were applied in consulting rooms, placed on a patient's skin by the physician's own hand, left to feed for 30 minutes or an hour until they dropped away gorged. Sometimes they were applied in hospital wards, a nurse making rounds with a jar, placing 3 leeches here for a headache, 5 there for an inflamed lung, 8 on the temples of a woman suffering from what the physicians called cerebral congestion. Sometimes they were applied in private homes, in bedrooms where the curtains were drawn and the air was thick with the smell of sickness, where a mother sat beside a fevered child and watched the leeches work with a hope born of desperation and handed down through generations. After feeding, the leeches were supposed to be destroyed, dropped into boiling water or crushed underfoot. This was the official instruction, based on the belief that a leech that had fed on diseased blood might carry that disease to the next patient. But in practice, many leeches were reused. Hospital nurses would collect the used leeches in buckets, salt them to make them vomit up the blood they had consumed, then rinse them and return them to the jar for the next patient. Private physicians sometimes did the same, especially with expensive continental leeches. The poor who purchased leeches to treat themselves always reused them, applying the same leech again and again until it died of exhaustion or injury. The apothecaries who accepted returned leeches knew this, but they said nothing, because the alternative was to admit that the entire system was built on compromises that the textbooks did not acknowledge. The trade sustained hundreds of people in London alone. The gatherers, mostly women, numbered perhaps 200 at any given time, though the population fluctuated as women entered and left the work, according to the demands of their other circumstances. The apothecaries numbered perhaps 30 who dealt primarily in leeches, and another 100 who kept them as one product among many. The hospital staff who applied the leeches, the physicians who prescribed them, the servants who transported them, all depended in some measure on the continuation of the practice. And beneath all of them, invisible and uncounted, were the leeches themselves, millions of them gathered from English marshes every year, their lives measured in the quantity of blood they could drain, their deaths unmarked except as losses in the apothecary's ledger. Thomas Critchley closed his shop at 8 each evening. He lived in the rooms above, alone since his wife had died, giving birth to a stillborn daughter 5 years previous. He would climb the stairs with a candle, the light throwing his shadow large against the walls, and he would sit at his desk and update his accounts, recording the day's sales and purchases, calculating his profit, planning his orders for the week ahead. Sometimes he would go to the back room and check the tanks, watching the leeches move sluggishly through the water, their bodies making small currents, their presence neither beautiful nor repulsive, but simply factual. He had been in this trade for 15 years. He expected to be in it for 15 more, or until he died, whichever came first. The thought did not trouble him. A man had to make his living somehow, and the leech trade was steadier than many others, more respectable than some. The leeches would always be needed. The sick would always require bloodletting. The marshes would always yield their harvest. And men like him would always stand between the gatherers and the physicians, facilitating the commerce that kept the system functioning. He blew out his candle and went to bed, and London settled into night around him. 2 million people sleeping or waking or dying, and among them the leech gatherers who would rise in a few hours and return to the black water before dawn. Chapter 3. The Healing Worm. The belief in bloodletting was older than London itself, older than England, older than the language that Londoners spoke. It stretched back through the centuries, through the medieval period when barber surgeons opened veins with their lancets, through the Roman Empire when Galen wrote his treatises on the balance of humours, through ancient Greece where Hippocrates taught that health was a matter of equilibrium and disease a matter of excess. The theory was simple, elegant, and entirely wrong, but it would take another 50 years and the development of new sciences before physicians would begin to question what their predecessors had believed without doubt for 2,000 years. The human body, according to the medical theory of 1842, contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humours existed in balance in a healthy person, but any disturbance of that balance would cause illness. Too much blood produced fever, inflammation, headache, apoplexy. Too much phlegm caused coughs, sluggishness, pallor. The yellow and black biles governed digestion and temperament. Treatment consisted of restoring balance, and the most common method of doing so was to remove the excess humour through purging, vomiting, sweating, or bleeding. Of these methods, bleeding was considered the most direct and effective for conditions attributed to excess blood, which included most fevers, most inflammations, and most of the acute illnesses that sent people to physicians. Bloodletting could be accomplished through several methods. The most dramatic was venesection, the opening of a vein with a lancet to drain substantial quantities of blood into a bowl. This was the method preferred for robust patients, for men in the prime of health who'd suffered sudden illness, for conditions like apoplexy or pneumonia, where large amounts of blood needed to be removed quickly. A skilled surgeon could open the median basilic vein in the crook of the elbow and drain a pint of blood in minutes. The patient sitting upright while the dark fluid poured out, their face gradually paling, their pulse gradually slowing, until the surgeon judged that enough had been taken and closed the wound with pressure and a bandage. But venesection required skill and carried risk. A surgeon who cut too deep might sever an artery. A vein opened in the wrong place might not bleed freely. Patients sometimes fainted from the shock or from the rapid loss of blood, and if they fell during the procedure they might strike their head or suffer other injury. For delicate work for children and women and the elderly, for conditions that required localized bloodletting rather than general depletion, physicians preferred leeches. The medicinal leech, Hiruda medicinalis, was a marvel of natural engineering for this purpose. Its body was segmented and muscular, capable of stretching to several times its resting length when engorged with blood. Its head bore a sucker equipped with 3 jaws, each jaw lined with tiny teeth arranged in a semicircular pattern. When the leech attached to skin, these jaws would saw back and forth, creating a Y-shaped incision so precise that patients often did not feel it happening. The leech's saliva contained substances that prevented blood from clotting, that dilated blood vessels to increase flow, that numbed the skin to reduce pain. A single leech could consume 5 to 10 times its own weight in blood, feeding for 30 to 60 minutes before detaching satiated. Physicians in 1842 believed they understood how leeches worked, though their understanding was incomplete and in some cases backwards. They knew the leech produced something that kept blood liquid, but they did not know the chemical composition or mechanism. They believed the leech's feeding reduced local inflammation by removing blood from the affected area, which was partially true but not for the reasons they thought. They prescribed leeches with the confidence of men who had seen the treatment produce apparent benefit, who had watched a patient's fever break after bloodletting, who had seen swelling reduce and pain diminish. That these improvements might have occurred regardless, that the body might have healed itself while the leeches fed, that the apparent benefit might have been due to the natural course of disease rather than the intervention, these possibilities did not occur to most physicians, or if they did occur, were dismissed. The medical journals of the period contain detailed instructions for the application of leeches. For headache, place 6 to 8 leeches on the temples. For inflammation of the eye, place 3 to 4 on the temple on the affected side. For congestion of the lungs, place 12 to 20 leeches on the chest. For inflammation of the liver, place 20 to 30 on the right side below the ribs. For suppression of menses, place 8 to 12 on the inner thighs. For inflammation of the brain, place 20 to 40 on the scalp, first shaving the area to ensure proper attachment. The numbers varied depending on the physician and the severity of the condition, but the principle remained constant. Remove blood from the area of disease, restore balance, allow nature to complete the healing. Some physicians developed reputations as specialists in leech therapy. Dr. William Harrison of Guy's Hospital published a monograph in 1838 titled On the Therapeutic Application of the Medicinal Leech, in which he described cases where leech treatment had produced remarkable cures. A woman suffering from severe headaches had been cured by the application of 40 leeches to her head over the course of a week. A man with inflammation of the lungs had been saved from certain death by the application of 60 leeches to his chest. A child with brain fever had recovered after treatment with 30 leeches applied to the scalp. Dr. Harrison included detailed case notes, describing symptoms and treatments and outcomes, building an empirical case for a therapy that needed no such defense because it was already universally accepted. Other physicians were more cautious, warning against excessive bloodletting and advocating for moderation in the number of leeches applied. Dr. Thomas Whately, founder of the Lancet Medical Journal, criticised physicians who prescribed hundreds of leeches for a single patient, arguing that such aggressive treatment weakened the body and hindered recovery. He documented cases where patients had died not from their disease but from the bloodletting meant to cure it, their bodies drained past the point of recovery, their hearts struggling to pump blood that was no longer there. But Dr. Whately did not oppose bloodletting itself, only its excess. He believed leeches had their place in medicine, used judiciously and with attention to the patient's overall condition. The leeches were applied by physicians in private practice, by hospital nurses in the wards, by apothecaries who offered medical advice along with their medicines, and by the patients themselves at home. The technique was simple enough that anyone could learn it. Clean the skin with water, place the leech on the desired spot, wait for it to attach. If it did not attach immediately, a drop of milk or blood on the skin would encourage it. Once attached, the leech would feed until it was satisfied, its body swelling visibly, turning from dark brown to glossy black, its length extending from 2 inches to 5 or 6. When it detached, it would fall away, leaving a small Y-shaped wound that would continue to bleed for several hours. This continued bleeding was considered beneficial, an extension of the bloodletting, and patients were instructed not to staunch it immediately, but to let it flow until it stopped naturally. The wounds left by leeches healed slowly and often left small scars, 3 tiny lines radiating from a central point. Patients who had been treated multiple times bore these marks across their bodies like strange tattoos, evidence of their medical history written in scar tissue. Some wore them as badges of survival, proof that they had been sick and had been treated and had lived. Others regarded them with shame, particularly women who bore leech scars on their thighs or breasts, marks that suggested intimate medical interventions that polite society preferred not to discuss. The efficacy of leech treatment was accepted as fact by nearly every physician in London. The Royal College of Physicians endorsed it. The medical schools taught it. The hospitals practiced it. The textbooks described it in detail. If a treatment had been used for thousands of years, if it had been recommended by Hippocrates and Galen, if it was practiced by respected physicians across Europe, then surely it must work. The idea that an entire profession might be mistaken, that a therapy practiced for millennia might be useless or harmful, that tradition and authority might be wrong, these were not thoughts that came easily to men trained to respect precedent and hierarchy. There were hints that the confidence was misplaced. Patients sometimes died after bloodletting, though physicians attributed this to the severity of the disease rather than the treatment. Patients sometimes recovered without bloodletting, though physicians attributed this to the mildness of the disease or the strength of the patient's constitution. Statistical analysis of outcomes, controlled trials, systematic comparison of treated and untreated patients. These methodologies did not yet exist in medical practice. Medicine in 1842 was based on theory and tradition, and the individual physician's experience, and when experience contradicted theory, it was experience that was questioned, not the theory. The leeches themselves, ignorant of medical philosophy, continued to feed when given the opportunity. They responded to warmth and carbon dioxide, to the chemical signals that indicated the presence of blood beneath skin. They attached and sawed through the epidermis and drank until they could drink no more, and then they fell away. And whether the patient recovered or died, the leech had fulfilled its nature. It was not a tool with consciousness or purpose beyond survival. It was a creature shaped by millions of years of evolution to detect hosts and feed on them. And humans had conscripted it into a medical system built on theories that made sense to the human mind but had no basis in biological reality. The partnership between physician and leech would continue for another few decades, gradually declining as new discoveries undermined the theory of humours, as new treatments based on chemistry and microbiology replaced the old reliance on bloodletting. But in 1842, that future was not yet visible. The leeches were still considered healers, instruments of medicine, weapons against disease. and they were applied by the thousands every day across London, draining blood from the sick in the belief that this would make them well. Chapter 4. The Women of the Water. The marsh at Wandsworth lay 3 miles south of the Thames, a remnant of the ancient wetlands that had once covered much of the river's floodplain before the city's expansion pushed back the wild places. It was smaller than the Battersea Marsh, perhaps 50 acres of reeds and pools and black mud, crossed by a few narrow paths that only the regular users knew. The women who gathered leeches here had their own community, separate from the Battersea gatherers, with their own customs and hierarchies and unspoken rules. They arrived before dawn and left when their jars were full or when the cold became unbearable, whichever came first. They did not sing while they worked. They did not speak except when necessary. The marsh demanded silence, and they gave it. Ellen Price had been gathering leeches at Wandsworth for 12 years. She was 34 years old, which was not particularly old by the standards of London's better neighbourhoods, but was considered getting on in years among the women of the rookeries. Her face was lined and weathered, her hands permanently stained and scarred, her back beginning to curve from the posture required to wade bent over through shallow water. She had come to the Leech gathering after her husband died of cholera during the outbreak of 1832, leaving her with 3 children and no means of support. Her choices had been limited: the workhouse, prostitution, or some form of labour that required no training and no capital beyond her own body. The Leeches had seemed the least terrible option. She lived in Southwark, in a street that had no name on any map but that residents called Cutthroat Lane for reasons that everyone knew but no one discussed. Her room was on the ground floor of a building that housed 14 families, sharing a single privy in the courtyard and a single pump that produced water brown with sediment. The room was perhaps 10 feet square, containing a straw mattress on the floor, a small table, a 3-legged stool, and a box that held their few possessions. She shared this space with her 3 children: William, who was 14 and worked as a crossing sweeper; Mary, who was 11 and did piecework sewing when she could get it; and young Ellen, who was 8 and still too small for regular work. They slept curled together on the mattress, using their coats as blankets, and they ate 1 meal a day, usually bread and sometimes a bit of cheese or a piece of fish if Ellen's gathering had been particularly successful. The life of a leech gatherer was measured in small degradations that accumulated over time. There was the cold, which began in October and lasted through April, a cold that penetrated wool and linen and skin and settled into bones and joints, and never fully left. Ellen's hands ached constantly during the winter, the joints swollen and stiff, the fingers difficult to bend. There was the wet, which rotted clothing and caused sores that would not heal, fungal infections between the toes, rashes on the legs that itched and wept and spread. There was the exhaustion, the need to rise at 3 in the morning and walk 3 miles to the marsh, to stand in water for 2 hours, to walk 3 miles back carrying jars filled with leeches and water, to deliver the harvest to the apothecary, to return home and attempt to sleep for a few hours before rising to do it all again. There was the blood loss. Ellen had calculated once during a sleepless night how much blood she'd given to the leeches over 12 years. If she gathered 4 dozen leeches 3 times a week, and each leech took a teaspoon of blood, that was 36 teaspoons per week, more than a cup. Multiply that by 50 weeks per year, allowing for the times when weather or illness kept her from the marsh, and she was losing 50 cups of blood each year. Over 12 years, that was 600 cups, or nearly 40 gallons. She had donated more blood to the leeches than existed in her entire body several times over. That her body had managed to replace it was a testament to the resilience of flesh, but the replacement was never complete, never perfect. She was always tired, always pale, always slightly out of breath when climbing stairs or carrying heavy loads. The physicians would have said she suffered from anemia, though they would not have connected it to her occupation, would not have thought to ask how she earned her living. The wounds left by the leeches were another source of constant difficulty. Each feeding left a small wound that continued to bleed for hours, that itched terribly as it healed, that sometimes became infected despite Ellen's attempts to keep them clean. She bore hundreds of small scars on her legs and arms, marks that would never fully fade. In summer, when skin was visible, these marks labelled her as surely as a brand labelled a criminal. People who saw the scars knew what she did, and they reacted with disgust or pity, or the careful blindness that Londoners reserved for things they preferred not to acknowledge. Ellen had learned to keep her limbs covered even in heat, to wear long sleeves and skirts that dragged in the mud, sacrificing comfort for invisibility. The other women who gathered leeches at Wandsworth bore similar marks, similar exhaustion, similar quiet desperation. There was Margaret Sims, whose husband was in debtor's prison and who supported 5 children on her leech gathering earnings. There was Jane Hobbs, who had been gathering for 20 years and whose health was so deteriorated that she could barely walk without assistance, but who continued to come to the marsh because she had no other means of survival. There was Rose Kelly, who was 16 and new to the trade, her face still hopeful, her body still strong, not yet understanding what the years would do to her. They worked near each other, but not together, each woman claiming her own section of the marsh through a system of precedence that rewarded long service with the best pools, the areas where leeches were most abundant. There was little camaraderie among the leech gatherers. This was not work that built friendships. The women were competitors for a limited resource, and while they did not actively sabotage each other, neither did they share information about where the leeches were feeding, or offer assistance unless emergency required it. Ellen had been helped once, when she had stepped into a pool deeper than she had anticipated, and had gone under completely, her heavy skirts dragging her down. Jane Hobbs had pulled her out, and Ellen had shared half her day's gathering in thanks, but they had never spoken of it again, never developed any bond beyond that single exchange. The marsh was a place of isolation despite the presence of others, each woman alone with her thoughts and her jars and the creatures that fed on her. The toll the work took on their bodies was obvious to anyone who looked, but few people looked at leech gatherers with any attention. They were part of London's vast underclass, the people who performed the dirty and dangerous work that kept the city functioning, but who remained largely invisible to those whose lives they sustained. The physicians who used the leeches did not think about where they came from. The patients who benefited from bloodletting did not consider the women who had waded into cold water to gather the creatures. The apothecaries who bought and sold the leeches regarded the gatherers as suppliers, no different than the farmers who brought vegetables to market or the miners who dug coal from the ground. The work was simply there, performed by people whose names no one knew, whose lives no one considered, whose suffering no one acknowledged. Ellen's children understood what their mother did but did not speak of it outside their room. William had been teased at school before he stopped attending, other boys calling his mother the leech woman, making sucking sounds when he passed, asking if his family drank blood for supper. He had fought back once, bloodying another boy's nose, and the schoolmaster had caned him for it, and after that he had simply stopped going. He told his mother he was needed to earn money, that his education was complete enough for the work he would do, and she had not argued because she knew he was right. There was no future for a crossing sweeper's son that required more schooling. Mary had learned to lie when asked what her mother did, saying she took in washing or did cleaning work, acceptable occupations that did not carry the stigma of the marsh. Young Ellen did not yet understand that their poverty was shameful, that her mother's work was regarded as degrading, and her innocence was something her mother treasured and dreaded losing. The money Ellen earned from leech gathering was never enough. 3 shillings 3 times a week came to less than 10 shillings weekly, and their rent alone was 4 shillings. Food consumed another 4 shillings if they ate carefully. Coal, candles, soap, the occasional necessity of new clothing when something wore beyond repair, these expenses left nothing for saving, nothing for illness, nothing for any emergency larger than a missed day of work. Ellen lived in constant fear of injury or sickness that would prevent her from gathering, knowing that a week without income would mean eviction, would mean the workhouse, would mean the separation of her family as the children were taken to the children's ward and she was sent to the women's ward, and they might never be reunited. She had tried other work over the years. She had taken in washing but found the competition too fierce and the pay too low, the hours of scrubbing laundry in cold water leaving her hands too damaged to hold the wet cloth. She had tried street selling, standing on corners with matches or watercress, but she lacked the boldness required to call out to passers-by, the willingness to beg that successful street sellers needed. She had sewn shirts for a middleman who paid 3p per shirt, but her eyesight was not good enough for the fine stitching required, and after a week he had rejected her work and refused to pay. The leeches, for all their horror, at least represented reliable income. The apothecaries would buy as many as she could gather. The demand never slackened. The work was always there, waiting in the black water. Sometimes Ellen allowed herself to imagine a different life. She imagined a small cottage in the country, a garden where she could grow vegetables, a fireplace that was always warm, her children clean and fed and safe. She imagined work that did not hurt, that did not drain her blood and strength, that allowed her to come home in daylight rather than creeping back to Cutthroat Lane in the grey dawn. But these imaginings were brief, fantasies that she pushed away almost as soon as they formed, because hope was dangerous when reality allowed no space for it. Better to focus on the next day's gathering, the next jar of leeches, the next 3 shillings that would keep them alive a little longer. The marsh at Wandsworth would remain until the city's expansion finally consumed it, which would happen in 1857 when developers bought the land and drained the wetlands to build houses for the growing middle class. The leech gatherers would scatter then, some finding other marshes farther from the city, others abandoning the trade entirely for other desperate work. But in 1842 the marsh still existed, still sheltered its population of leeches, still drew the women who had no other choice. Ellen Price waded into the dark water each morning before dawn, and the leeches found her skin and she counted them carefully, and she carried them to the apothecary, and she received her coins, and she returned to Cutthroat Lane, and she slept a few hours and then she rose and the cycle began again. This was her life. This was what survival required. She did not think of it as noble or as tragic. It simply was, like the rain, like the cold, like the city that surrounded her with its million indifferences. She endured because there was nothing else to do but endure. Chapter 5. The Physician's Demand. The consulting room at number 43 Harley Street belonged to Dr. Edmund Blackwood, a physician of considerable reputation who specialised in diseases of women and children. The room was furnished in the manner expected of a successful medical man. Mahogany desk with leather top, glass-fronted cabinets containing medical texts bound in calfskin, anatomical drawings in gilded frames, an examination table covered in clean linen, and in the corner, a tall ceramic jar filled with water in which 20 medicinal leeches waited in their drowsy torpor. Dr. Blackwood purchased his leeches from Thomas Critchley, paying a premium for the largest and most vigorous specimens, and he used on average 30 leeches per week in the treatment of his patients. He had practiced medicine for 22 years, had trained at Edinburgh under some of the finest anatomists in Britain, and he believed absolutely in the therapeutic value of bloodletting. His patients came from London's wealthiest families. They arrived in carriages that waited in the street while coachmen sat patient on their boxes. They wore silk and velvet and fine wool, carried parasols and walking sticks, spoke in the refined accents of education and privilege. They came because they were ill, or because they believed themselves ill, or because illness was fashionable among women of a certain class, a delicate constitution being considered a mark of refinement. Dr. Blackwood treated them with grave courtesy, listening to their complaints with an expression of serious attention, examining them with hands that were clean and professional, prescribing treatments that included not just leeches, but also tonics and rest and changes of air and diet. His morning on this particular Tuesday in March 1842 began with Mrs. Caroline Ashford, the wife of a banker, who suffered from severe headaches that had plagued her for 3 months. She reclined on the examination table while Dr. Blackwood stood beside her, his fingers pressed against her temples, feeling the pulse beneath the skin. The pulse was strong, perhaps too strong, suggesting an excess of blood to the brain. He explained this to Mrs. Ashford in terms she could understand, speaking of pressure and congestion, and the need to relieve the burden on the delicate vessels of the head. He retrieved 6 leeches from the jar, selecting them carefully, checking that they were active and responsive. He placed them in a small bowl and carried them to the examination table. Mrs. Ashford closed her eyes. She'd been leeched before and knew what to expect, but she still tensed slightly when Dr. Blackwood placed the first leech against her temple. The creature attached immediately, its jaws breaking through the thin skin, and within moments it was feeding steadily. Dr. Blackwood placed 3 more leeches on each temple, arranging them in a careful pattern, then stepped back and consulted his pocket watch. He would allow them to feed for 45 minutes, by which time they would have removed approximately half a pint of blood, enough to reduce the congestion without causing weakness. While Mrs. Ashford lay still with the leeches feeding, Dr. Blackwood wrote notes in her file, documenting the treatment and the reasoning behind it. He noted that this was her 3rd leech application in as many weeks, that the headaches had diminished somewhat but not disappeared entirely, that he intended to continue the bloodletting twice weekly until the condition resolved completely. He did not question whether the leeches were actually helping. The theory was sound. Excess blood caused pressure. Removing blood reduced pressure. The logic was elegant and the treatment was orthodox. If Mrs. Ashford continued to suffer headaches, it meant only that more bloodletting was required, not that the treatment itself was flawed. His next patient was Lady Thornton, whose daughter Elizabeth was 7 years old and suffering from what Dr. Blackwood had diagnosed as inflammation of the brain. The child had been feverish for a week, complaining of headache and showing signs of confusion and agitation. Lady Thornton had sent for Dr. Blackwood 3 days ago, and he had prescribed immediate and aggressive bloodletting. Young Elizabeth lay on the examination table now, her face pale as paper, her eyes glazed with fever or exhaustion, or the cumulative effect of having 30 leeches applied to her scalp over 3 days. Dr. Blackwood examined her carefully, feeling her pulse, looking at her tongue, pressing gently on her abdomen. The fever had diminished, which he took as evidence that the treatment was working. He prescribed 10 more leeches to be applied to the base of her skull, and he instructed Lady Thornton to continue with the cooling compresses and the restricted diet of barley water and beef tea. Lady Thornton watched as Dr. Blackwood placed the leeches on her daughter's neck, watched as they attached and began to feed, watched as small rivulets of blood ran down onto the white linen. She trusted Dr. Blackwood completely. He had delivered both her children, had treated her husband's gout, had saved her own life when she had suffered a fever 3 years ago through vigorous bloodletting that had, he said, prevented the fever from reaching her brain. If he said Elizabeth needed more leeches, then Elizabeth needed more leeches. The alternative was to doubt, and doubt was dangerous when your child's life hung in the balance. Better to trust the physician, to follow his instructions, to believe that the suffering served a purpose. Throughout the morning, Dr. Blackwood applied leeches to 6 more patients. A gentleman suffering from congestion of the lungs received 12 leeches on his chest. A young woman with suppressed menses received 8 leeches on her inner thighs, applied by Dr. Blackwood's assistant while he waited outside the examination room, propriety requiring this separation even in medical treatment. An elderly man with inflammation of the liver received 20 leeches placed across his right side, the creatures feeding in rows that looked almost decorative. A middle-aged woman suffering from hysteria received 6 leeches applied to her abdomen, Dr. Blackwood explaining that this would draw the excess blood away from her womb, which was the seat of feminine emotional disturbance. By noon, Dr. Blackwood had used 43 leeches, more than his usual daily consumption, and he would need to send his assistant to Critchley's shop that afternoon to replenish his stock. This was not unusual. During the winter months when respiratory illnesses and fevers were common, his Leech consumption often doubled or tripled. He kept careful records of his usage, not for financial reasons, but for medical curiosity, tracking which conditions required the most bloodletting, which patients responded best, which treatments produced the most reliable results. Over 22 years, he had accumulated thousands of case notes, all filed in the cabinets that lined one wall of his study, a library of suffering and treatment that he sometimes reviewed in the evening, looking for patterns, for insights, for confirmation of the theories he had learned as a student. The demand for leeches across London's medical establishment was staggering when aggregated. Guy's Hospital alone used 200 leeches on an average day, more during epidemic seasons. St Thomas's used a similar number. The other hospitals, St Bartholomew's and the Middlesex and the London Hospital, each used between 50 and 100 daily. The private physicians, numbering perhaps 500 in London, used on average 10 to 20 leeches each per week. The apothecaries who prescribed medical treatment used smaller numbers, but their cumulative demand was substantial. When these numbers were added together, the result was approximately 15,000 leeches consumed in London every week, more than 750,000 every year. This demand drove the entire leech trade, from the women wading in the marshes to the apothecaries maintaining their tanks, to the porters carrying jars through the streets. It was steady demand, reliable demand, demand that had existed for decades and showed no signs of diminishing. The medical establishment had no reason to question the practice. Bloodletting worked because it had always worked, because ancient authorities said it worked, because generations of physicians had observed its effects and documented its benefits. That these observations might be flawed, that the documented benefits might be coincidental or imaginary, that the entire edifice of theory might rest on faulty foundations. These possibilities existed outside the boundaries of acceptable thought. Dr. Blackwood finished his morning consultations and sat at his desk, reviewing the day's treatments, making notes for follow-up appointments. Mrs. Ashford would return in 3 days for another application. Young Elizabeth Thornton would be examined daily until her fever broke completely. The gentleman with lung congestion would require bloodletting twice weekly for a month. Each treatment represented income, of course. Dr. Blackwood charged 2 guineas for a consultation that included Leech application, a substantial sum but not unreasonable for a Harley Street physician. His annual income was approximately £800, comfortable but not lavish, sufficient to maintain his practice and his household, and to support the charitable work he did 2 afternoons each week at the dispensary in Whitechapel, where he treated the poor without charge. He did not think of himself as contributing to the suffering of women like Ellen Price, did not make any connection between his demand for leeches and the women who gathered them. The leeches simply appeared when he needed them, purchased from the apothecary, kept in their jar, applied to patients as required. The economic chain that connected his consulting room to the black water of Wandsworth Marsh was invisible to him, as invisible as the chain that connected his breakfast tea to the plantations of Ceylon or his mahogany desk to the forests of Honduras. London ran on such chains, thousands of them, millions of them, connecting consumption to production, comfort to labour, health to suffering. The connections existed, but they were not examined because examination would have required acknowledging complicity, and complicity was uncomfortable for men who believed themselves to be healers. In the afternoon, Dr. Blackwood's assistant, a young man named Peter Godwin, who was training to become a physician himself, walked to Critchley's shop to purchase more leeches. He carried a leather bag with compartments and a purse containing 5 shillings, enough to buy 5 dozen leeches at the going rate. The walk took him through neighbourhoods that gradually declined in respectability, from the broad streets of Marylebone through narrower streets where shops gave way to workshops, until he reached Critchley's establishment near the edge of Belgravia. He made this journey 3 times a week, and he had come to know the route well, had learned which streets to avoid after dark, which corners were claimed by beggars or prostitutes, which alleys smelled worst of sewage and rot. Critchley greeted him with professional courtesy, pulling jars from the holding tanks, counting leeches with practiced speed, wrapping them carefully in damp cloth before placing them in Godwin's bag. They exchanged few words beyond the transaction. Critchley asked after Dr. Blackwood's health. Godwin commented on the weather. Money changed hands. The visit lasted less than 10 minutes. Godwin walked back toward Harley Street, the bag heavy with jars, careful not to jar them too roughly, maintaining the steady pace that would get him back to the surgery before the afternoon consultations began. He passed a woman on Belgrave Street, a woman with the worn face and stained hands of the working poor, and something in her posture suggested the particular exhaustion of the leech gatherer. Godwin did not know this for certain. He had never been to the marshes, had never seen the gathering process, had never thought much about where leeches came from beyond the vague understanding that they lived in water and were caught somehow. But this woman bore the marks, the too pale skin, the way she moved as if each step required conscious effort. Their eyes met for a moment as they passed, and in that moment something like recognition flickered, an acknowledgement of connection, of the web that bound their lives together. Then the moment passed. Godwin continued toward Harley Street. The woman continued toward whatever destination awaited her. The city flowed around them both, indifferent and vast. Dr. Blackwood's evening was spent at home with his wife and 2 daughters, dining on roast mutton and potatoes, reading in his study afterward, the fire burning cheerfully in the grate, the house warm and comfortable. He did not think about the leeches waiting in their jar in his consulting room. He did not think about the patients who would arrive tomorrow requiring treatment. He did not think about the marshes or the women who worked them or the economic system that sustained his practice. These thoughts did not occur to him because they were not necessary. He was a healer. He treated the sick. He applied the methods he had been taught by men he respected, methods validated by centuries of practice and endorsed by the most prestigious medical institutions in Europe. That was enough. That had to be enough, because to question it would require questioning everything, and everything was too large to question when you had patients waiting, and a practice to maintain, and a family depending on your income. The leeches would be needed tomorrow. The women would gather them tomorrow. The system would continue tomorrow. And Dr. Blackwood would treat his patients with the same grave courtesy and absolute confidence that he had shown today, because that was what physicians did, and he was a physician, and the alternative was unthinkable. Chapter 6. The Price of Blood. Mary Pickett had been gathering leeches for 17 years, longer than any other woman working the Battersea Marsh. She was 41 years old, though she looked closer to 60, her body bent and weathered by nearly 2 decades of standing in cold water before dawn. She had 7 children living and 3 dead, though dead was perhaps the wrong word for the 2 she had miscarried in the marsh itself, having felt the cramping pains begin while she stood waist-deep in black water, having delivered the tiny unformed bodies into the same water where the leeches fed, having walked home afterward with blood running down her legs, and the morning's gathering of leeches in her jar because she could not afford to lose the income. The 3rd dead child had been born alive but had lived only 4 days, turning blue and cold despite Mary's attempts to warm him, dying in her arms on a January morning while her husband was at the docks looking for work. The physical toll of leech gathering accumulated in ways both visible and invisible. The visible marks were obvious enough. Mary's legs were covered in scars from ankle to thigh. Hundreds of small Y-shaped marks where leeches had fed over the years, the scars so dense in some places that they overlapped and merged into patches of discoloured skin that looked almost scaled. Her hands were similarly marked, and her arms, and even her neck from the few times she had fallen and been submerged long enough for leeches to attach to her throat. The scars themselves were not painful, but they announced her occupation to anyone who saw them, made her instantly recognisable as a leech gatherer, marked her as belonging to one of London's lowest castes. The invisible damage was worse. Mary was chronically anemic, her blood perpetually depleted by the weekly loss to the leeches. She tired easily, climbing the 3 flights of stairs to her room in the rookery near the Old Kent Road, with stops at each landing to catch her breath. Her heart raced when she exerted herself, pounding visibly in her chest, struggling to push blood that was too thin through vessels that had grown weak. She suffered from frequent infections, the leech wounds providing entry points for bacteria that thrived in the marsh water. These infections manifested as red streaks radiating from the bite sites, as swollen lymph nodes in her groin and armpits, as fevers that lasted days and left her shaking and delirious. She treated these infections as she treated most ailments, by ignoring them until they either resolved on their own or worsened to the point where she had no choice but to seek help. Help, when she sought it, came from the dispensary in Bermondsey, a charity establishment where a physician attended 3 mornings a week to treat the poor. Mary had been to the dispensary perhaps a dozen times over the years, always waiting until she was desperate because losing even half a day's work meant losing half a day's income. The physician, a young man who rotated through the dispensary as part of his training, would examine her briefly, note the leech scars with a grimace, prescribe rest and better nutrition, neither of which Mary could afford. Once, when an infection in her leg had become so severe that red streaks reached nearly to her hip, the physician had prescribed leeches to draw out the poison. Mary had laughed, a sound so bitter that the physician had looked offended, and she had explained what she did for living. He had changed his prescription to poultices and told her to stay out of the marsh for a week. She had stayed out for 2 days, until the fever broke enough that she could walk, and then she had returned because 2 days without income had already put her family behind on rent. The chronic blood loss affected more than just her energy. It affected her ability to think clearly, to remember things, to maintain the mental sharpness required to navigate London's complicated geography and economy. She forgot appointments, forgot which apothecary paid the best prices, forgot sometimes which day of the week it was. She moved through her life in a kind of fog, functioning on habit and routine rather than conscious thought. This deterioration was gradual enough that she did not recognize it as abnormal, had nothing to compare it to except memories that grew increasingly unreliable as the years passed. Her menstrual cycles had become irregular and eventually stopped altogether when she was 37, her body unable to maintain the normal rhythms of fertility when it was constantly fighting to replace lost blood. The cessation of menses had been a relief in some ways, one less source of blood loss, but it had also brought other changes. Sudden fevers and mood swings, and an aching in her joints that never entirely disappeared. She had heard other women talk about the change of her life as something that happened to older women, women in their 50s, but it had come to Mary early, pushed forward by the constant drain on her physical resources. The other leech gatherers showed similar damage, though the specifics varied from woman to woman. Anne Driscoll had lost most of her teeth by age 35, her body unable to maintain healthy bone when calcium was being diverted to replace lost blood. Catherine Ward suffered from a persistent cough that brought up blood-streaked phlegm, her lungs damaged by years of breathing the cold, damp air of the marsh before dawn. Rose Kelly, the youngest of the regular gatherers, had not yet shown severe damage, but she had begun to develop the same pallor that marked the others, the same breathlessness, the same vulnerability to infection. The wounds themselves, the small Y-shaped incisions left by each leech, carried their own risks beyond infection. The leech's anticoagulant saliva meant that each wound continued to bleed for hours after the creature detached, sometimes for an entire day if the leech had been particularly large or had fed particularly well. This extended bleeding was considered normal, even beneficial according to the physicians who prescribed leeches for medical treatment, but for the women who gathered leeches it meant constant blood loss beyond what the creatures took directly. Mary often had 20 or 30 wounds bleeding simultaneously, her clothes soaked with blood, the smell of it following her through the streets as she walked home from the marsh. She had tried various methods of stanching the flow. Pressing cloth against the wounds helped somewhat, but she could not maintain pressure on all of them at once, could not work effectively with her hands occupied by bandaging. Some gatherers used salt water to help the blood clot faster, but salt was expensive and the wounds were too numerous to treat them all. Most simply accepted the bleeding as part of the work, changing their undergarments frequently, washing them in the river or at the public pump, hanging them to dry in their rooms where they stiffened with dried blood and had to be beaten soft before they could be worn again. The cumulative effect of this blood loss over years was devastating. Mary had weighed perhaps 9 stone when she began gathering leeches at age 24. She now weighed perhaps 6 stone, her body having consumed its own muscle and fat in the effort to maintain basic functions, while constantly replacing blood. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had lost its elasticity. She looked like someone in the advanced stages of consumption or cancer, someone visibly dying, and in a sense she was dying, though slowly enough that each day's deterioration was imperceptible. Other women had died from the work more dramatically. Mary had witnessed 3 deaths in her 17 years of gathering. The first had been a woman named Susan Fletcher, who had fainted in the marsh one winter morning and had fallen face forward into shallow water. By the time anyone noticed, Susan had drowned, unable to lift her head from water that was less than a foot deep. The second death was Jenny Wright, who had developed an infection that spread to her blood, killing her in 4 days despite the best efforts of the dispensary physician. The third was Martha Collins, who had simply not woken up one morning, her heart having finally given out after too many years of trying to circulate too little blood through a body that needed more. These deaths were not investigated. No coroner's inquest was held. The women were buried in paupers' graves, their bodies collected by the parish and interred in mass graves at the edge of the city, marked only by wooden posts that rotted away within a few years. Their families received no compensation, no acknowledgement, no recognition that the work had killed them. They were simply gone, their spots in the marsh taken by new women who needed income desperately enough to accept the risks. Mary thought about death sometimes during the long walks to and from the marsh, during the hours standing in cold water. She did not fear it exactly, but neither did she welcome it. Death would mean the end of hardship, but it would also mean abandoning her children to whatever fate awaited them without her protection. Her oldest son was 15 now, working as a mudlark on the Thames, searching the banks at low tide for anything that could be sold, cold fragments or nails or bits of rope. Her oldest daughter was 13, doing piecework embroidery in a sweatshop in Bethnal Green. The 5 younger children still depended on Mary's income for food and shelter. If she died, they would likely end up in the workhouse, separated and sent to different institutions, unlikely to ever find each other again. This knowledge kept her wading into the marsh each morning, despite the exhaustion, despite the pain, despite the certain knowledge that the work was killing her incrementally. There was no escape from the trap. Mary could not save money because there was never surplus income to save. She could not find different work because she had no skills beyond leech gathering and no strength to learn new ones. She could not rely on charity because charity was scarce and grudging and came with conditions that were often worse than the poverty they purported to relieve. She could not depend on her husband because he drank whatever wages he earned, stumbling home late at night smelling of gin, sometimes violent, always useless. She'd considered leaving him, but leaving would mean losing their room, and finding another room on her income alone would be impossible. The price she paid for those 3 shillings 3 times a week was her health, her youth, her strength, her future. It was a price extracted in blood, literally, ounce by ounce, week by week, year by year. The system that demanded this price was vast and impersonal. The physicians who used the leeches did not know her name, did not know she existed, would have been horrified if they had understood the human cost of their medical treatments, but would not have changed their practice because medical theory demanded leeches, and medical theory was not to be questioned. The apothecaries who bought her leeches saw her as a supplier, a vendor. no different than any other link in the commercial chain. The patients who benefited from bloodletting never thought about the origin of the creatures that fed on them. Mary understood none of this in systematic terms. She did not have the education or the leisure to analyse the economic structures that constrained her life. She understood only that she needed money to survive, that gathering leeches provided money, that stopping would mean starvation or the workhouse or prostitution, options that seemed worse even than the slow death by blood loss. So she continued, because continuation was all she knew, because habit was stronger than hope, because the alternative required a kind of courage she did not possess, or perhaps a kind of despair she had not yet reached. On this particular morning in early April 1842, Mary stood in the marsh at Battersea as she had stood thousands of times before. The water was cold but not freezing, the sky beginning to pale, the leeches attaching to her legs with their familiar pressure. She counted them mechanically, reached the number she had learned was safe, began the process of removal. Her hands shook slightly from weakness or cold or both. Blood seeped from yesterday's wounds that had not fully closed. She placed the leeches in her jar, watching them settle into the water, dark shapes against glass. The morning's gathering was complete. She waded back to shore, put on her shoes, began the walk toward the apothecary. The sun rose. The city woke. Mary walked through streets that were beginning to fill with people, invisible among them. One woman among thousands, marked by scars no one looked at, dying by degrees no one measured, paying a price no one acknowledged. This was Tuesday. Tomorrow would be Thursday. She would return to the marsh. The leeches would feed. The blood would flow. The price would continue to be extracted shilling by shilling, drop by drop, until there was nothing left to give. Chapter 7. The Science of Suffering. The lecture hall at Guy's Hospital was built in the amphitheatre style, with rows of wooden benches rising steeply from a central floor where demonstrations took place. On this February morning in 1842, the benches were filled with medical students, young men in dark coats with notebooks open on their laps, pens ready to record the wisdom being dispensed from below. The lecturer was Dr. William Harrison, physician to the hospital and author of the monograph on leech therapy that had become required reading in London's medical schools. He stood beside a table on which lay a patient, a woman of perhaps 30 years who had been admitted to the hospital 3 days earlier, suffering from inflammation of the lungs. She was conscious but quiet, her eyes moving from the doctor to the students to the ceiling, her chest rising and falling with the laboured breathing that had brought her to seek treatment. Dr. Harrison addressed the students in the confident tone of a man who had given this lecture many times, who had no doubt about the truth of what he was teaching. He explained the theory of inflammation, how it resulted from excess blood rushing to the affected area, how this excess caused heat and swelling and pain, how the treatment must therefore involve removing the excess blood to restore balance. The logic was clear. The mechanism was understood. The treatment was orthodox. He gestured to the patient, pointing out the signs of her condition, the rapid breathing, the fever evident in her flushed face, the pain she experienced when drawing deep breath. These symptoms all indicated that blood had accumulated in her lungs beyond what the vessels could properly contain, that the inflammation was growing worse, that immediate intervention was required to prevent the condition from becoming fatal. He called for leeches. An attendant brought a jar containing 20 specimens, large and active. Dr. Harrison selected 12 of them, explaining to the students that he was choosing the most vigorous feeders because the severity of the inflammation required aggressive bloodletting. He placed the leeches on the patient's chest in 2 rows of 6, arranging them with the precision of an artist composing a canvas. The leeches attached quickly, their jaws breaking through skin, their bodies beginning the rhythmic contractions that drew blood from the vessels beneath. The patient gasped slightly at the first attachment, then fell silent again, enduring the treatment with the resignation of someone who had no other choice. Dr. Harrison continued his lecture while the leeches fed, explaining the physiological processes involved. The blood, he said, was composed of 4 humours that must be kept in balance for health to be maintained. In cases of inflammation, the sanguine humour, which corresponded to blood itself, became excessive. This excess manifested as heat and redness and swelling, as the vessels engorged with more blood than they could properly manage. The inflammatory process, if left unchecked, would spread through the body, affecting first the adjacent tissues and eventually the vital organs. Death from pneumonia was essentially death from unchecked inflammation, the lungs filling with excess blood and fluid until breathing became impossible. The treatment, therefore, was to remove the excess blood before it could cause irreversible damage. Leeches were ideal for this purpose because they could be applied directly to the affected area, drawing blood from the precise location where the inflammation was worst. The general bloodletting accomplished through venesection had its place, certainly, but for localized inflammation, leeches were superior. Each leech could remove approximately half an ounce of blood, and the wound it left would continue to bleed for several hours afterward, potentially removing an additional ounce. 12 leeches, therefore, could remove 12 to 24 ounces of blood, more than a pint, enough to significantly reduce the burden on the inflamed tissues. The students wrote furiously, recording Dr. Harrison's words, sketching diagrams of leech placement, noting the quantities and durations he recommended. This knowledge would form the foundation of their practice when they became physicians themselves, when they treated their own patients in their own consulting rooms or hospital wards. They were learning medicine as it had been practiced for 2,000 years, as it was described in the classical texts, as it was endorsed by the most prestigious institutions. None of them questioned the theory. Questioning would have marked them as poor students, as insufficiently respectful of tradition, as unsuitable for the profession they hoped to enter. Dr. Harrison checked his pocket watch. The leeches had been feeding for 30 minutes. Several had already detached, their bodies swollen to 3 times their original size, dark and glossy with consumed blood. He removed the remaining leeches using the technique he had demonstrated many times, sliding his fingernail between jaw and skin, allowing the creatures to release without tearing tissue. The patient's chest was marked with 12 Y-shaped wounds, all bleeding freely, small rivulets of blood running down her sides and soaking into the linen beneath her. Dr. Harrison pointed out these wounds to the students, explaining that this continued bleeding was beneficial, that it should not be stanched immediately, but allowed to persist for several hours to maximize the bloodletting effect. He proceeded to examine the patient, feeling her pulse, listening to her breathing, pressing gently on her chest. The pulse, he announced, was slower than before, indicating that the excess blood had been reduced. The breathing seemed somewhat easier, though it was difficult to tell after only one treatment. The fever remained high, but fevers were slow to respond to bloodletting and might require several days of treatment before they broke completely. He prescribed another application of 12 leeches to be performed the following morning, and a third application the morning after that, and then a reassessment of her condition to determine whether further bloodletting was required. The students asked questions. How many leeches could safely be applied to a single patient? Dr. Harrison replied that the number depended on the patient's constitution and the severity of the inflammation, but that he had successfully treated cases with up to 60 leeches applied over the course of a week. Could leeches be applied to children? Yes, certainly, though in smaller numbers proportionate to the child's size. Could they be applied to pregnant women? Yes, with caution, avoiding the abdomen but using them freely on other parts of the body. Could they be applied during menstruation? This required more careful consideration, as menstruation itself was a form of natural bloodletting, but in cases of severe inflammation, additional leeching might still be beneficial. The lecture continued for another hour, covering other topics related to bloodletting, the use of lancets for venesection, the application of cupping glasses to draw blood to the surface, the use of scarificators to make multiple small incisions at once. But leeches remained the focus. Leeches were the preferred method. Leeches were the tool that every physician must master if he hoped to treat inflammatory diseases successfully. Dr. Harrison's enthusiasm for leech therapy was evident in every sentence, in every example, in every case study he cited. He believed absolutely in what he was teaching, believed it with a certainty that came from years of practice and the endorsement of medical authority and the apparent evidence of his own observations. What he did not mention, what he did not acknowledge, what perhaps he did not even recognize, was that his observations were filtered through a theory that predetermined their interpretation. When a patient recovered after bloodletting, he attributed the recovery to the treatment. When a patient died despite bloodletting, he attributed the death to the severity of the disease, or to insufficient bloodletting, or to constitutional weakness. The possibility that bloodletting might be ineffective, that it might actually harm patients by weakening them when they most needed strength, that the apparent benefits might be due to the natural course of disease rather than the intervention, these possibilities existed outside the framework through which he interpreted his experience. The medical journals of 1842 were filled with articles describing successful leech treatments. Dr. Harrison's own publications included dozens of case studies documenting recoveries that he attributed to bloodletting. Other physicians published similar studies. The accumulated weight of this published literature created an edifice of apparent evidence, thousands of cases all pointing to the same conclusion, that bloodletting worked. What the literature did not include were the failures, the patients who died after aggressive bloodletting, the cases where treatment seemed to worsen outcomes. These failures existed, certainly, but they were explained away, attributed to factors other than the treatment itself, and so they did not appear in the medical journals, did not influence the consensus, did not cause physicians to question their assumptions. The theory of humours on which the entire practice rested was elegant and internally consistent and completely wrong. The body did not contain 4 humours that needed to be balanced. Blood was not a humour, but a tissue, a liquid tissue that carried oxygen and nutrients and fought infection, and performed 100 other functions that physicians in 1842 barely understood. Inflammation was not caused by excess blood, but by the body's immune response to injury or infection, a complex cascade of chemical signals and cellular responses that serve protective and healing purposes. Removing blood did not cure inflammation. It weakened the body's ability to fight the underlying cause, deprived tissues of oxygen and nutrients, slowed healing, increased mortality. But these truths were decades away from discovery. The germ theory of disease would not be established until the 1860s. The understanding of immune function would come still later. The development of controlled clinical trials that could definitively test whether treatments worked would not emerge until the 20th century. In 1842, medicine was still based on theory rather than rigorous empirical testing, on authority rather than evidence, on tradition rather than innovation. And the tradition said that bloodletting worked, and authority confirmed it, and theory explained it. And so physicians like Dr. Harrison continued to apply leeches by the thousands, continued to train new generations of physicians in the practice, continued to refine and document and defend a treatment that was at best useless, and at worst actively harmful. The lecture ended. The students closed their notebooks and filed out of the amphitheatre, chattering among themselves about what they had learned. The patient remained on the table, still bleeding from 12 wounds, still struggling to breathe, still suffering from pneumonia that the leeches had done nothing to cure. An attendant came to move her back to the ward, to clean the blood from the table to prepare the space for the next demonstration. The used leeches were collected in a bucket, to be salted and rinsed and reused on other patients later that day. The jar was refilled from the hospital's stock, maintained in a large tank in the basement where hundreds of leeches waited in the darkness. The system continued, self-perpetuating, self-justifying, immune to doubt, because doubt was not part of medical education, not part of professional identity, not part of the culture that defined what it meant to be a healer. Dr. Harrison returned to his office to prepare for his afternoon rounds. He would visit perhaps 20 patients in the hospital wards, examining them, prescribing treatments, adjusting dosages of medicines or numbers of leeches based on their progress or lack thereof. He would do this with the confidence of expertise, with the certainty that he was helping, that his interventions made a difference, that the years he'd spent studying medicine had equipped him to reduce suffering and save lives. He would never know, would die without knowing, that much of what he did was useless or harmful, that many of his patients recovered despite his treatment rather than because of it, that the leeches he applied so carefully were draining blood that sick bodies desperately needed to fight their illnesses. He would never know because the knowledge did not exist yet, because medicine had not yet developed the tools to distinguish between what worked and what merely seemed to work, between healing and the appearance of healing. The science of suffering in 1842 was not science at all but philosophy dressed in medical terminology, theory masquerading as fact, tradition enforced through institutional authority. And at the centre of this system mediating between theory and patient were the leeches, creatures drained from marshes by women who paid with their blood, sold through networks that extracted profit at each step, applied to the sick by physicians who believed they were healing, participating unwittingly in a vast theatre of suffering that served no purpose except to perpetuate itself. The leeches fed because that was their nature. The physicians prescribed them because that was their training. The patients endured them because they trusted their physicians, and the women gathered them because they had no choice. Each part of the system sustained every other part, locked together in a structure that seemed permanent and necessary and right, even as it consumed lives and health and hope in service to a theory that had never been true and a practice that had never worked. The lecture hall emptied. The day continued. The suffering continued, and no one questioned whether there might be a better way. Chapter 8. The Rookery's Shadow. The rookery called Jacob's Island lay in Bermondsey, on the south bank of the Thames, built on wooden pilings driven into mud that had been accumulating since Roman times. It was a warren of decaying houses connected by narrow walkways and bridges, some of which had collapsed into the black water beneath, leaving gaps that residents navigated in darkness by memory and faith. The houses leaned against each other for support, their timbers rotted by damp, their walls patched with whatever materials could be scavenged. Canvas and tin and board stolen from demolished buildings elsewhere. Perhaps 3,000 people lived in Jacob's Island, though no census taker had ever successfully counted them, and no authority had ever successfully imposed an order on this place that existed at the very bottom of London's hierarchy of desperation. Sarah Good lived here with her 3 children and her mother-in-law, sharing 2 rooms in a house that trembled visibly when heavy carts passed on the street beyond. The rooms were on the 2nd floor, reached by an exterior staircase that was more ladder than stairs, the treads worn smooth and slippery. One room served as kitchen and living space, furnished with a table that had 3 legs and leaned against the wall for support, 2 stools, and a small stove that burned coal when they could afford it, and burned anything combustible when they could not. The 2nd room held the sleeping area, a pile of straw covered with whatever cloth they owned, blankets and coats and dresses layered together to provide insulation from the cold that seeped through the walls. The rent was 3 shillings and 6pence per week, due every Monday morning to a rent collector who climbed the ladder stairs with a ledger and a heavy stick, marking payments in his book with the stub of a pencil, making notations beside the names of those who could not pay. Sarah had been late with the rent twice in the past year, once when she'd fallen ill and missed 3 days of gathering, once when the apothecary had reduced his prices suddenly and her income had dropped below what she needed. Both times the rent collector had given her a week's extension, but had made clear that a 3rd failure would result in eviction, that the landlord had a waiting list of families desperate enough to take these rooms despite their condition. The poverty of Jacob's Island was not the poverty of misfortune, but the poverty of structure, the the poverty built into London's economy that required a class of people to perform the worst work for the lowest wages so that the rest of the city could function. The women who lived here were rag pickers and mudlarks and crossing sweepers and leech gatherers, jobs that required no skill and paid barely enough to survive. The men were labourers at the docks when work was available, beggars when it was not, thieves when desperation overcame caution. The children were workers from the age of 5 or 6, sent into streets to sell matches or flowers or their bodies, contributing their pennies to the household income because every penny mattered when the difference between survival and the workhouse was measured in shillings. Sarah's children were 9, 7 and 4. The oldest, Thomas, worked as a mudlark on the Thames, wading through the filth at low tide searching for anything that could be sold. He brought home perhaps 6pence a week, his hands cut from broken glass and pottery shards, his feet infected from walking through sewage, his lungs damaged by the fumes that rose from the river mud. The middle child, Elizabeth, was too young for regular work but helped her grandmother with piecework, sewing buttons onto cards for a penny per gross. The youngest, James, was not yet useful except to watch that the stove did not go out, a responsibility he took seriously, feeding it splinters and paper scraps throughout the day. The rookery operated under its own laws, separate from the legal system that governed the rest of London. The police rarely entered Jacob's Island, and when they did, they came in groups, armed, moving quickly to arrest someone specific and then leaving, before the residents could organise resistance. Crime was not reported to authorities but handled through informal systems of justice that involved negotiation or violence or both. Theft from neighbours was rare because everyone was equally poor, and because the penalty, imposed by collective agreement, was banishment, which meant certain death from starvation or exposure. Theft from outside the rookery was common and accepted as necessary, a redistribution of resources from those who had excess to those who had nothing. Disease was endemic in Jacob's Island. Cholera swept through every few years, killing dozens in a matter of days, the victims dying in agony from dehydration as their bodies expelled fluids faster than they could be replaced. Typhus was constant, spread by the lice that infested every dwelling, causing fever and delirium and death, particularly among children whose bodies had no reserves to fight the infection. Tuberculosis was so common that the cough and blood-streaked sputum were simply part of life, background noise like the creaking of the houses and the smell of sewage. The dispensary in Bermondsey treated some cases, but the physicians were overwhelmed and the medicines were limited, and most people simply endured their illnesses until they either recovered or died. Sarah had learned to navigate this world through strategies developed over years of survival. She woke at 2 a.m. to walk to the marsh, returning by 8 to check on her children and her mother-in-law before attempting to sleep for a few hours. She bought food at the end of the day when prices dropped, purchasing bread that was a day old, vegetables that were beginning to rot, occasionally meat that was grey and smelled questionable but could be boiled into something edible. She never bought gin, though the temptation was constant and the gin shops were everywhere, and half the women in Jacob's Island drank to numb the misery of their lives. She had seen what gin did, how it started as relief and became necessity and ended with women lying in gutters or selling themselves for pennies, or dead in alleyways with their children screaming beside them. The other leech gatherers who lived in the rookeries followed similar patterns, their lives structured by the demands of survival that left no space for anything else. They worked and slept and worked again, their days measured in the distance from marsh to apothecary to home, their weeks measured in the accumulation of coins that were never quite enough. Some had husbands, though the word husband meant different things in Jacob's Island than it did in respectable neighbourhoods. Some men stayed and contributed to the household, working when they could find work, helping with children when they were home. Others drifted in and out, present for weeks or months and then gone, reappearing later with no explanation expected or given. Still others were violent or drunk or both, their presence more burden than help, tolerated only because a woman alone was more vulnerable than a woman who could claim some man's protection. The children of the rookery grew up understanding that survival required accepting conditions that people in other parts of London would have considered intolerable. They understood hunger as a permanent condition rather than a temporary state, understood cold as something to be endured rather than remedied, understood that illness meant suffering without treatment, because treatment cost money they did not have. They learned early that the world was divided into those who had and those who had not, and that they belonged permanently to the latter category, that no amount of work or virtue or hope would change this fundamental fact. Sarah's son Thomas had asked her once, when he was perhaps 6 years old, why they were poor when other people were rich. She had tried to explain that some people were born to wealth and some to poverty, that this was simply how the world was ordered, that God had reasons that humans could not understand. Thomas had considered this explanation with the seriousness of a child trying to make sense of injustice, and then he had asked whether God loved rich people more than poor people. Sarah had not known how to answer. She had said that God loved everyone equally, but even as she said it, she knew the answer was inadequate, knew that her son could see the contradiction between the claim of equal love and the reality of unequal circumstances. Thomas had stopped asking questions after that, had simply accepted poverty as fact, had learned to navigate the rookery's demands with a competence that meant survival. The rookery had its own economy separate from the larger economy of London. Goods moved through informal networks, sold from hand to hand, prices negotiated on doorsteps and in narrow passages. A woman might buy a loaf of bread in the morning and sell half of it in the evening for a penny more than she paid, the penny profit buying coal or candles or another small necessity. A man might purchase a stolen coat for 6p and resell it for 9p, the 3p difference contributing to his family's survival. Children ran errands for pennies, carrying messages or packages through the maze of walkways and stairs, their knowledge of the rookery's geography worth small coins from those who lacked it. Credit existed, but in forms that would have been unrecognisable to the merchants of Cheapside. A woman might lend a neighbour 2p with the understanding that it would be repaid when possible. No interest charged, no documentation required, the agreement enforced by social pressure rather than law. The pawnshops on the edges of the rookery operated on similar principles, lending small amounts against items of little value, a cooking pot or a blanket or a pair of shoes, charging interest that compounded weekly until the item was forfeited. Sarah had pawned her wedding ring years ago, receiving 5 shillings for a piece of brass that might have been worth a shilling to anyone who bothered to assess it accurately, and she had never had 5 shillings at once to redeem it. The women who gathered leeches were bound together by their occupation but not by solidarity. They competed for spots in the marsh, competed for the attention of apothecaries who might pay better prices, competed in the desperate arithmetic of survival that made everyone else a potential threat to one's own subsistence. There was little warmth between them, little friendship, little sense of common cause. They existed in parallel rather than together, each woman focused on her own survival, and her own children's survival, unable to spare energy or resources for broader concerns. Sarah had tried once to organise the leech gatherers, had suggested that they might negotiate collectively with the apothecaries for better prices, that their combined leverage might allow them to demand 6p halfpenny per dozen rather than 6p. The other women had listened politely and then returned to their individual negotiations, unwilling to risk what little they had on a collective action that might fail. Sarah had understood their reluctance, had felt it herself, the fear that any change might make things worse rather than better, that the apothecaries might simply refuse to buy from organised gatherers and would instead find more compliant suppliers elsewhere. The rookery at night was a landscape of darkness punctuated by small lights, candles burning in windows, fires in the few stoves, occasionally the glow from a gin shop where men and women gathered to drink away their wages. The sounds were human sounds, crying and shouting and laughing and the 1,000 small noises of people living too close together. The smell was sewage and rot and coal smoke and bodies, a permanent miasma that residents stopped noticing after the first few weeks, but that marked them when they ventured into other neighbourhoods, an odour that clung to clothes and hair and announced their origin as clearly as any sign. Sarah sat sometimes at her window in the evening, looking out over the narrow passage below, watching the life of the rookery unfold in the space between buildings. She saw women returning from work, their faces exhausted, their movements slow with fatigue. She saw children playing games with sticks and stones, their laughter thin and quick, ready to transform into something else at the first sign of danger. She saw men standing in groups, talking in low voices, sometimes arguing, sometimes silent together in the companionship of shared poverty. She saw the rookery as it was, not as anyone pretended it should be, a place of desperation and endurance, and the small acts of humanity that survived even in conditions designed to crush humanity out of people. The poverty that drove women like Sarah into the marsh was not personal failure but systemic design. London needed its poor to perform its dirtiest work, needed them desperate enough to accept wages that were insufficient for survival, needed them numerous enough that they competed with each other rather than organising collectively. The leech gatherers were one small part of this vast machinery of exploitation, their blood literally extracted to serve medical practices that benefited the wealthy, while the cost was borne entirely by those who could least afford to pay it. The system was self-sustaining because it was invisible to those who benefited from it, because the physician in his Harley Street consulting room never saw the rookery, never thought about where his leeches came from, never connected his comfort to someone else's suffering. Jacob's Island would be demolished in the 1860s, the land cleared and rebuilt with warehouses and factories, the residents scattered to other rookeries or to the workhouse or simply lost in the churn of London's poor. But in 1842 it stood, a monument to the brutality that underlay Victorian prosperity, a place where women rose before dawn to wade into black water and offer their blood to creatures that would be used to drain blood from others, a place where children understood hunger as normal and cold as permanent and death as frequent. A place that existed because London's economy required it to exist, and because the people with power to change such things preferred not to look too closely at how their city actually functioned. Sarah would return to the marsh tomorrow. Her children would wake hungry. The rent would be due Monday. The rookery would continue, and the shadow it cast was long enough to cover everything, though those who lived in the light never saw it. Chapter 9. The Fading Practice. The first serious challenge to bloodletting as medical orthodoxy came not from London but from Paris, where a physician named Pierre-Louis published a study in 1835 that compared outcomes for pneumonia patients treated with bloodletting to those treated without it. The study showed no significant difference in mortality between the two groups, suggesting that bloodletting provided no benefit. The publication caused considerable debate in French medical circles, and the debate eventually crossed the Channel to England, where it was received with skepticism by the majority of physicians but with interest by a small minority who were beginning to question traditional practices. Dr. Thomas Whately, editor of The Lancet, was among those who took Lewis's study seriously. He had been critical of excessive bloodletting for years, though he had not questioned the fundamental validity of the practice. Louis' data gave him ammunition to argue for moderation, for careful assessment of individual cases rather than routine application of leeches to every inflammatory condition. In 1840, The Lancet published an editorial arguing that bloodletting had been overused, that physicians should consider whether removal of blood actually helped their patients or merely weakened them, that tradition should not override observation. The editorial caused outrage among established physicians. The Royal College of Physicians issued a statement defending bloodletting as essential to proper medical practice. The senior physicians at Guy's Hospital and St Thomas's Hospital published responses arguing that The Lancet was undermining confidence in proven treatments, that questioning bloodletting would lead patients to avoid necessary medical care, that the ancient wisdom of Hippocrates and Galen should not be dismissed based on a single French study. Dr. William Harrison wrote a lengthy rebuttal citing his own extensive experience with leech therapy, documenting cases where bloodletting had clearly saved lives. But the debate had been opened, and once opened, it could not be closed again. More physicians began to pay attention to their outcomes, to notice that some patients recovered whether they were bled or not, that others died despite aggressive bloodletting, that the correlation between treatment and recovery was less clear than theory predicted. The younger generation of physicians, those training in the early 1840s, were more willing to question orthodoxy than their predecessors had been. They had been educated in an environment where scientific method was beginning to influence medicine, where observation and measurement were starting to matter, more than tradition and authority. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible year to year, but cumulative over the course of the 1840s and 50s. Physicians began to prescribe fewer leeches, to reserve bloodletting for cases where they judged it truly necessary, rather than applying it routinely. The hospitals began to reduce their leech consumption from 200 per day at Guy's Hospital in 1840 to perhaps 100 per day by 1850. The private physicians who served wealthy patients became more conservative in their use of bloodletting, aware that their patients were beginning to question aggressive treatments, that the culture was shifting away from the idea that more intervention was always better. Thomas Critchley noticed the change in his business around 1846. His sales to hospitals remained steady, but his sales to private physicians began to decline. Physicians who had once purchased 5 dozen leeches per week were purchasing 3 dozen, then 2 dozen. Some stopped purchasing leeches entirely, having decided that the treatment was of questionable value, and that other methods were equally effective and less distressing to patients. Critchley's income declined accordingly, slowly at first, and then more rapidly as the trend accelerated. By 1850, his annual income had dropped by nearly half compared to 1840. He discussed this change with other apothecaries at their occasional meetings in Holborn. They were all experiencing similar declines. The consensus was that this was a temporary fluctuation, that medical fashion would swing back toward bloodletting as it had swung away, that they simply needed to endure the lean period. But as the years passed and the decline continued, some apothecaries began to diversify their businesses, reducing their investment in leech stock, building up their trade in other medicines, in tonics and purgatives and the new chemical preparations that were becoming available from manufacturers. Critchley was slower to adapt, having built his entire business around leech trading, having developed expertise and connections that were specific to that market. By 1855, he was struggling to maintain his shop, to pay his rent, to keep his holding tanks filled with stock that was increasingly difficult to sell. The leech gatherers felt the change more acutely because they had no ability to diversify. Sarah Good and Mary Pickett and Ellen Price and the other women who worked the marshes found that the apothecaries were buying fewer leeches, that prices had dropped from 6p per dozen to 4p, that some weeks the apothecaries refused to buy at all, claiming their stock was adequate. The women's income dropped proportionally. What had been barely sufficient became clearly insufficient. Some women tried to compensate by gathering more leeches, by wading into the marsh more frequently, by pushing their bodies harder in an attempt to maintain their earnings. But the leeches themselves were becoming scarcer as the marshes were drained for development, and the effort required to gather a dozen leeches increased as their population declined. Mary Pickett was among the first to abandon leech gathering, though abandon was perhaps too strong a word. In 1851, at age 50, her body simply failed. She'd been growing progressively weaker for years, the chronic blood loss and repeated infections finally overwhelming her constitution. She collapsed in the marsh one November morning, fell face forward into the water as Susan Fletcher had done years before, but Mary was pulled out by Catherine Ward before she drowned. She was carried home and placed in her bed, and she did not rise from that bed again. Her children took turns sitting with her, watching as she faded, her breathing growing shallow, her consciousness drifting. She died 3 weeks later, her body finally depleted beyond recovery. The parish buried her in a pauper's grave, and her 7 living children were sent to different workhouses, separated as she'd always feared they would be. Other gatherers left the trade for different reasons. Rose Kelly, who had started gathering in 1840 as a girl of 16, married in 1852, and her husband forbade her from continuing the work. Ashamed of the leech scars that marked her legs and arms, wanting his wife to look respectable even if they remained poor, she found work in a laundry instead, standing over steaming tubs 10 hours a day, her hands scalded by hot water and lye, but at least no longer offering her blood to leeches. Anne Driscoll died in 1853, not from the work directly, but from cholera during an outbreak that killed hundreds in Southwark. Catherine Ward worked until 1855, when she was perhaps 75 years old, then simply stopped coming to the marsh, her absence noted by the other gatherers but not investigated. Her fate unknown. Sarah Good continued longer than most, driven by the same desperation that had brought her to the marsh in the first place. Her children were older now, her sons working at the docks, her daughter in service in a household in Kensington, but she still needed income to maintain her room in Jacob's Island, still needed the coins that leech gathering provided, even as those coins became fewer and harder to earn. By 1858, there were perhaps 20 women still gathering leeches in the Battersea and Wandsworth marshes, down from the 200 who had worked there in 1840. The marshes themselves were shrinking, the land being purchased by developers who drained the wetlands and built houses, the pools where leeches had lived for thousands of years disappearing under brick and mortar. The medical profession's abandonment of bloodletting accelerated in the 1860s as new understanding of disease began to emerge. The germ theory of disease, proposed by Louis Pasteur and developed by others, provided a completely different framework for understanding illness. Disease was not caused by imbalance of humours, but by microscopic organisms that invaded the body. Treatment should focus not on removing blood, but on supporting the body's defences and on developing medicines that could kill the invading organisms. Bloodletting not only failed to help, but actively harmed by weakening patients when they needed strength to fight infection. By 1865, bloodletting had largely disappeared from mainstream medical practice. The textbooks that had once devoted chapters to leech application now mentioned it only in passing or not at all. The medical schools stopped teaching it as a primary treatment. The hospitals eliminated their leech stocks, their holding tanks drained and dismantled, the space converted to other uses. The private physicians who had once kept jars of leeches in their consulting rooms now kept stethoscopes and thermometers, and the new instruments that represented modern medicine's tools. The Royal College of Physicians quietly revised its official positions, no longer endorsing bloodletting, allowing the practice to fade into history without formal acknowledgement that it had been wrong all along. Thomas Critchley closed his shop in 1863, unable to sustain a business that no longer had demand for its primary product. He sold his remaining stock for a few pounds, dismantled his holding tanks, packed his ledgers and personal belongings. He found employment as a clerk in a wholesale drug company, work that paid less than his shop had in its prime but provided steady income. He never spoke about his years as a leech trader, never mentioned the thousands of transactions he'd facilitated, the network of women whose blood had flowed through his hands in the form of the creatures he bought and sold. That part of his life simply ended, became something he had done once but no longer did, a chapter that closed with neither drama nor significance. The few remaining leech gatherers scattered to other work as the market disappeared entirely. Some became washerwomen or seamstresses or street sellers. Some entered the workhouse, having no other option when their earning capacity ended. Some simply disappeared from the historical record, their names and fates unknown, their existence marked only by the leech scars that they carried until death. The knowledge they had accumulated, the understanding of marsh ecology and leech behaviour, and the techniques of gathering, all of this disappeared with them, unrecorded and unvalued because it had served a practice that was now recognised as worthless. Sarah Good made her last journey to the marsh in 1864. She was 54 years old, though she looked decades older, her body worn to transparency by 22 years of blood loss. The Battersea Marsh was smaller than she remembered, much of it drained, the remaining pools surrounded by construction sites where new houses were rising. She waded into the water one final time, felt the cold that she had felt thousands of times before, waited for the leeches that no longer came in abundance. She gathered perhaps a dozen, not enough to justify the journey, not enough to sell to apothecaries who no longer bought. She stood in the water as dawn came, watching the light spread across a landscape that was changing, that was being transformed into something she did not recognize, that no longer had a place for women like her. She returned to Jacob's Island, to the room she still occupied, though the rookery itself was scheduled for demolition. She sat at her window, the jar of leeches on the table beside her, and she did not know what to do with them. There was no market for them anymore. The apothecaries would not buy them. The hospitals did not want them. They were simply creatures she had gathered out of habit, out of the repetition of action that had defined her adult life. She carried them down to the Thames that evening and poured them into the river, watching them disappear into the black water, returning them to the element from which they had come. Then she climbed back up to her room, and she did not go to the marsh again. The practice had faded, had been revealed as mistaken, had been abandoned by the medical profession that had once embraced it as fundamental truth. But the women who had sustained that practice, who had paid for it with their blood and their health and their lives, received no acknowledgement, no compensation, no recognition that they had been sacrificed to a system that had never served any purpose except to perpetuate itself. They had gathered leeches because physicians demanded leeches, and physicians had demanded leeches because medical theory said leeches were necessary, and medical theory had been wrong, and the wrongness had cost countless lives, both the patients who were weakened by bloodletting and the women who were destroyed by gathering the creatures that made bloodletting possible. The practice faded. The women were forgotten, and history moved forward, as it always did, leaving its casualties behind. Chapter 10. The Last Lantern. The marshland at Wandsworth in 1870 was almost entirely gone, converted to streets and houses and small factories that produced goods for London's endless consumption. A few pools remained, isolated pockets of wetland trapped between developments, too small to be worth draining, left as reminders of what the land had been. The leeches still lived in these pools, their population diminished but persistent, waiting in the mud for hosts that rarely came anymore. The women who had once gathered them were gone, dead or scattered, their occupation rendered obsolete by changes in medical practice that they had not understood and could not have influenced. Ellen Price was 72 years old in 1870. She'd survived her years of leech gathering barely, and had lived to see the trade disappear entirely. Her children were grown, scattered across London and beyond, her daughters in service, her son working as a clerk in a shipping company, their lives slightly better than hers had been, though still constrained by the accident of their birth into poverty. Ellen lived alone now in a room in Southwark, not in Cutthroat Lane, which had been demolished years ago, but in a slightly better street where the houses were brick instead of wood, and the rent was 4 shillings a week instead of 3 and 6pence. She survived on the modest income from her children, and on the occasional work she could still find, though work was scarce for a woman in her 70s, whose hands shook with palsy, and whose eyesight had failed to the point where she could barely distinguish faces at arm's length. She thought about the marsh sometimes during the long hours when she sat alone in her room, with nothing to occupy her except memory. She remembered the cold, the way it had felt to stand in water before dawn, the sensation of leeches attaching to her skin. She remembered the other women, their names and faces, though most of them were dead now, had been dead for years. She remembered Sarah Good, who had died in 1866 when the rookery at Jacob's Island was finally torn down and the residents dispersed, Sarah having nowhere to go and no strength left to find anywhere. She remembered Mary Pickett, dead before the practice ended, her body destroyed by the work before she could see it become obsolete. She remembered dozens of others, women whose names she had never learned, who had worked beside her in silence and had disappeared one by one. The leech scars still marked Ellen's legs and arms, faded now but permanent, small Y-shaped marks that she could trace with her fingers when she could not sleep. The scars were her history, written on her body in a language that no one else could read, evidence of decades spent offering her blood to creatures that had been used to drain blood from others, participating in a system that had benefited no one except perhaps the apothecaries who had profited from trading in suffering. She felt no bitterness about this, or perhaps the bitterness had been worn away by time and exhaustion, until all that remained was a kind of numb acceptance. She had done what she had to do to survive, that the work had been based on false medical theory, that it had served no purpose, that her suffering had been unnecessary. These revelations changed nothing about her past, made no difference to the years she had lost, the health she had sacrificed, the blood she had given. The marsh at Wandsworth, or what remained of it, was separated from the nearest houses by a wooden fence that had been erected to keep children from drowning in the pools. Ellen walked there sometimes, a journey that took her nearly 2 hours now that her legs barely functioned, her joints swollen with arthritis, her lungs damaged by years of breathing cold, damp air. She would stand at the fence and look at the water, dark and still, and she would remember standing in that water, would remember the sensation of leeches feeding, would remember the other women who had stood there with her. The pools looked smaller than she remembered, or perhaps everything looked smaller when viewed from the distance of years. No one gathered leeches from these pools anymore. The practice had ended. The trade had collapsed. The entire system had been dismantled so thoroughly that it was difficult to believe it had ever existed. The hospitals no longer kept leech stocks. The physicians no longer prescribed bloodletting. The apothecaries no longer bought and sold the creatures. The women no longer waded into cold water to gather them. All of it had simply stopped, rendered obsolete by changes in medical understanding, by the recognition that bloodletting had never worked, that thousands of years of practice had been based on theory that was fundamentally wrong. Ellen thought about the physicians sometimes, the men in their Harley Street consulting rooms who had prescribed leeches with such confidence, who had believed they were healing when they were harming, who had never known or cared where the leeches came from. She wondered if any of them had ever questioned the practice, had ever noticed that their patients often failed to recover despite bloodletting, had ever connected their medical treatments to the suffering of women like her. She doubted it. The physicians had lived in a different world, a world where medicine was theory and tradition and authority, where questioning orthodoxy was unprofessional, where the human cost of treatment was invisible because the people who paid that cost were invisible. The few people who knew Ellen's history reacted to it in different ways. Her daughter, when Ellen had once tried to explain what her years of leech gathering had been like, had become upset and angry, had demanded to know why Ellen had subjected herself to such horror, why she had not found other work, why she had allowed her body to be destroyed. Ellen had not known how to explain that there had been no other work, that the alternatives had been worse, that survival had required accepting whatever work was available regardless of the cost. Her daughter, who had been born after Ellen started gathering and had never known real hunger, could not understand choices made in desperation, could not imagine a world where standing in freezing water and offering your blood to leeches was the best option available. Her son never mentioned the leech gathering, had made it clear through silence that he preferred not to acknowledge this part of his mother's past, that he was ashamed of how his family had survived, that he wanted to believe they had always been respectable working people, rather than the desperate poor who did whatever work would keep them alive. Ellen did not blame him for this. Shame was a luxury of those who had escaped poverty, who wanted to forget where they had come from, who needed to believe that their current respectability was earned through virtue rather than luck and circumstance. The marsh at Wandsworth would be completely filled and built over by 1880, the last pools drained, the last leeches dying in mud that dried to dust before the houses rose. But in 1870 it still existed, a small remnant of the vast wetlands that had once covered the Thames Valley, and Ellen Price still visited it occasionally, standing at the fence, looking at water that held memories she could not articulate and did not try to share. She was the last of the leech gatherers, or one of the last, the others dead or disappeared, their occupation vanished, their lives forgotten by everyone except themselves. She died in 1873 in her room in Southwark, alone because her children were at work and could not sit with her during the day. The parish buried her in a common grave, her name recorded in a register that would eventually be lost in a fire decades later, all record of her existence erased except for the memories of her children, and they would die in turn, and then there would be nothing, no monument, no acknowledgement, no recognition that she had lived and worked and suffered. She was 75 years old, which was old for a woman of her class, old for someone who had spent decades in cold water losing blood to creatures that served a medical practice that had never been valid. The history of the leech trade disappeared along with the women who had sustained it. The medical texts that mentioned bloodletting in the 1840s simply dropped the topic in later editions, the practice vanishing from medical literature as if it had never existed. The economic records of the apothecaries were discarded or lost, the ledgers that documented thousands of transactions thrown away when the businesses closed or were sold. The marshes were built over, their ecology destroyed, their history buried under streets and houses. Within a generation, no one remembered that women had once waded into these places before dawn to gather leeches, that an entire trade had existed based on the harvesting of blood-feeding creatures, that the practice of medicine had once required the constant supply of leeches gathered at great human cost. The story survived only in fragments, in occasional mentions in memoir or diary. In the records of dispensaries that treated the infections leech gatherers contracted, in the statistical abstracts that showed declining leech imports from the continent as domestic gathering decreased. But these fragments were scattered and unconnected, never assembled into a coherent narrative, never recognised as documenting something significant about Victorian medicine and Victorian poverty and the human cost of systems that link suffering in one place to comfort in another. The leeches themselves survived, their species persisting in scattered populations across England and Europe, living in the few remaining wetlands, occasionally feeding on cattle or deer or unlucky swimmers, no longer harvested commercially, no longer valued or vilified, simply existing as they had existed for millions of years before humans discovered their properties and conscripted them into medical practice. They were Hirudo medicinalis, the medicinal leech, though medicine no longer wanted them, their anticoagulant saliva occasionally studied by scientists interested in its chemical properties, but no longer applied to patients in the belief that removing blood would cure disease. The medical profession never apologized for bloodletting, never acknowledged the harm it had caused, never compensated the patients who had been weakened or killed by aggressive bloodletting, or the women who had been destroyed by gathering the leeches that made the practice possible. The practice simply faded, was recognized as a mistake, was abandoned, and medicine moved forward to new treatments, some effective and some not. The profession's confidence undiminished by the recognition that it had been fundamentally wrong about something it had believed for thousands of years. The last lantern in the marsh belonged to no one, belonged to memory, belonged to the hours before dawn when women had worked in cold water, their lives measured in the creatures they gathered, and the blood they lost and the coins they earned that were never quite enough. The lantern's light faded as the sky paled, as the city woke, as the daily business of London began, markets opening and factories starting, and the vast machinery of commerce and survival grinding forward without pause or reflection. The marsh fell silent. The water grew still, and in that stillness, if you listened carefully, you might hear the echo of women's voices calling across decades and distance, speaking of things that had been endured and survived and finally ended, speaking of the price that had been paid by those whose names were not recorded, whose suffering was not acknowledged, whose lives were spent sustaining practices that served no purpose except to perpetuate themselves. The history turned its page in the dark, as history always did, moving from one chapter to the next without ceremony or closure, leaving behind the casualties and the forgotten, the women who had waded into black water and offered their blood, the physicians who had prescribed bloodletting with absolute confidence in theory that was absolutely wrong, the patients who had endured treatments that harmed them, the apothecaries who had traded in creatures drawn from the marsh, all of them participants in a system that had made sense within its own logic, but had never been grounded in truth. The page turned. The century advanced. The leeches remained in their pools, waiting in the mud, their patience infinite, their nature unchanged, oblivious to the human drama that had briefly elevated them to medical significance, and then abandoned them to obscurity once again. The last lantern's light went out, and the marsh remembered nothing, because the marsh was only water and mud, and the creatures that lived there. A memory required someone to remember, and all those who remembered were gone. The candle burned low, the chamber fell silent, and history once again turned its page in the dark.